Hey there, AP learners. Coming to you from A102 here at Sherman High School. This is Mr. Shear, and we are actually starting content today. So hopefully you're ready to dive into this. Some of the stuff you were exposed to through the summer assignment over the summer. So let's get straight into it. We're also going to be doing some writing today, so just plenty of fun for you. But we're talking today about pre-Columbian Native Americans. So without further ado, let's go get on in here. So, early American civilizations. This is something that you should have some working knowledge of if you have completed your summer assignment and have done the Native American chart. If you have not, a lot of this is going to seem like it's going really fast and you don't know what we're talking about. Do your chart, okay? If you haven't done the reading that I suggested, this is going to seem like you don't know what we're talking about. Do your reading. You need to do the pre-work in order for these lectures and everything else like that to go smoothly. If you don't have that prior information, it is going to be hard. So let's get straight into it, and we're going to start with a question. I want you to respond to the following prompt in a well-developed paragraph. Note, well-developed. To what extent were the many Native American groups in pre-Columbian America diverse in terms of culture and customs? To what extent were the many Native American groups in pre-Columbian America diverse in terms of culture and customs? Okay, so you're going to respond to that in a paragraph. My advice to you, since you're doing this virtually and it's going to pop up here and ask you to type that paragraph in, I would still do it paper and pencil first, okay? If I were you right now, when this pauses, I'd go and get paper and pencil. If you don't have it right now, I'd write it out and work it out there first before you type. That's just how I work. Maybe you do it a little bit differently, but especially when constructing something like this, maybe there might be a little bit of scratching and re-editing and everything else like that. Your call, but I definitely approach it that way. So you're going to write a full paragraph responding to that prompt. It should take you a little bit of time if it's well crafted. So it should take you at least 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to pause it here, give you a chance to put together your paragraph about to what extent the many Native American groups in pre-Columbian America were diverse in terms of culture, customs. Okay. This very well could be an essay prompt, by the way. So we're going to take this and we're going to set it aside for now, and we're going to revisit that in just a few minutes towards the end of this lesson. We're going to talk a little bit more about these Native American groups first off. If we want to go all the way back, which is probably where this should all start, is we have to talk about where natives likely or probably first came into the Americas. There are probably several groups that entered North America from several different directions, but the one that, of course, if you had American history or studied this before, the one that gets the most play is going to be, is going to be coming across on the Bering Strait during one of the ice ages when all of this land was frozen. They came across this Bering Land Bridge, or when the continents were a little bit closer together. There in that area. Sorry, there we go. Had trouble aiming on my mouse there for a second. So they came across that area in the Bering Strait, walking across on frozen land, and then down across into North America and into what we would consider to be the United States and then South America. This migration pattern to America probably explains a large portion of our ancient Americans, but possibly and potentially not all, which they estimated could have come from several different directions from the east as well. So our most ancient Native Americans likely came this direction and dispersed their population throughout. Now, by the way, this is a long time that has to pass as they gradually spread their civilizations down and spread out across the Americas. So we're talking about hundreds or even thousands of years as this occurs. So that takes time till all of these native groups. We need to fast forward many years before we see Europeans show up and be like, oh, you're the natives. Okay, so that's one explanation for these ancient Americans. But that's a long time ago. And I want you to think about just how much history or American history takes place prior to really much of anything that we or anybody else will study. Okay, that's thousands of years, or at the very least, hundreds of years that of really not really recorded history that's taking place. And that matters. That matters because so much develops in a people over hundreds of years. Custom, culture, tradition, religion, all of those things are being built and specified during that time. Okay? That's going to bring us, we're going to fast forward us a little bit towards those cradle or empire civilizations, which are going to be some of the first that European settlers find when they come. We're talking about our Aztecs, we're talking about our Mayans, we're talking about all those groups, the Incas in South America. Those are our big empire type native civilizations that you should have read about quite a bit in the text. And the primary importance of, or the probably one of the most important facts that revolves around these great civilizations is maize cultivation, okay? And this is kind of like that key deal there, okay? So we can talk about all of these different things culturally, and it's really interesting, and that's something that you probably covered significantly in world history. But one thing that I want to focus on, what maybe separates them from other groups that we're going to discuss that usually spread a little bit farther north, is maize cultivation. And why these empires grow so large probably has a lot to do with this. So I want you to think about these empires in terms of that agricultural phenomenon and answer these questions. So first, why do you think that the cultivation of maize leads to a larger and stronger civilization? Why would that matter? What's going on there that's creating these large, strong civilizations as opposed to other groups that are not doing it? Okay? The second question I want to ask is, why does increased population, because we saw that happen in a lot of these empire civilizations, why does an increased population seem to equate to prosperity? Why do large peoples seem to be successful people, or peoples that are widespread and experience population growth? Why does that seem to result in prosperity? What do you think the possible reasons are for that? Okay, let's examine some possible answers here. What is it about maize that's making these civilizations so large and strong? Why can't a hunter-gatherer group like that grow to be this vast empire? Well, there's a couple things about this that make it possible. Maybe you came up with something similar, maybe yours is a little bit different, but think about some of these things. Maize cultivation requires minimal labor. And what that means is few people can harvest large amounts of food. This is huge because for a couple of reasons. Number one, you can make more food, right? If it only requires a few people to harvest a large amount, then that means the surplus is going to be significant. You can make more food. More food means that probably a larger and stronger civilization. But further than that, a smaller labor force also implies the idea that people can specialize in other things. Not everyone in the society is required to labor to feed the people, right? And we'll get to that in just a minute as to why that is significant. Okay. Also, keep in mind, maize, or as we would probably refer to it, corn today, which is similar. It's cheap. It's efficient food source. It's nutrient rich, and it's a hearty food that would support a good population and a healthy population. And there's lots of it, okay? So as far as a well-nourished and healthy people, it's probably a strong and reliable source of nourishment. And then finally, because of how much you can grow, it creates a great surplus. And if you have a surplus, you're an economically stable group and you have trade goods. If you've got lots of food, you've got something you can trade. You have a currency with other groups. If you have that currency, you're going to bring more things into your own society that's going to be success, that's going to lead to your growth and success. So maybe you came up with something different, and there are certainly other answers there, but I think those have a lot to do with why maize would lead to these gigantic empires. Okay, now here's the second one, and this kind of is tied to the same idea. If we're going to have these growing populations due to this very sustainable crop of maize that just breeds growth, population growth, then how come population growth means we're going to have prosperity? Why does more people mean more wealth? You know, you would think, well, maybe it divides wealth and makes people poor. But in this case, think about this. When there's more people, that means, and particularly when maize is such a is not very labor intensive, you've got people that can do other jobs. Okay, not everybody is tied up in the growth of the staple crop, and so you get specialization of labor in many different things, and people have time to pursue other things, whether it's science or technology or the social services, all of these kinds of things. There are more people to do different kinds of work. Not everyone is engaged in the work that is going to keep people alive, okay, and sustain because there's food on their plates. So you get astronomers, and you get people, you get scientists, and you get engineers of sort. All these kinds of people working within a society is going to breed a more prosperous society. Okay. Also, an increased population gives you a tremendous military advantage, right? Because if you have a large population, you don't have to worry so much about the conquering of other groups coming in. You have that strength, and so you have that advantage. And when you are the strongest, that means that you might just happen to be able to collect the spoils of war and everything else that comes along with that that advantage. You know, there's an economic term that kind of comes into play here, which is called economies of scale. Economies of scale means that the bigger that you are, the easier it is to profit off of certain things. And this is a complicated economic concept, but you know right now that there are certain types of businesses that you could never start because it costs so much money, and you would need so much of an investment up front. It's easy to start small businesses and certain things. You could make a cake shop, right? But you couldn't start a cell phone company because, well, you need to buy some towers, okay? So an economy scale means when there's more people and there's more wealth altogether, it becomes easier to create even more people and more wealth. And so that in itself means that it's going to lead to increased prosperity. Maybe you came up with something different there, but it's just really interesting. You look at these vast empires and you think, why? And it really, a lot of it boils down to this very sustainable agricultural crop that they have that allows for this kind of growth and prosperity, and really can only be toppled by European disease and all the other things that we know that are going to come in later. So it's a very fascinating phenomenon, and really sets these groups a little bit apart from some of the other ones that we're about to look at on this click. So our North American native groups are much smaller and very different, but these are the ones that are probably going to play a much larger role in our discussion of American history. But there are many different groups and many different characteristics to these groups. And some of the ones that I had you look at on your chart include the Mississippi Valley groups. So some examples of them will be the Hopewell Indians, the Cahokias. And by the way, I'm going to say all kinds of Indian name groups here and probably mispronounce several of them, so that if I do, and you're like deep in Native American heritage, and you're like, Mr. Scheer, you have no idea what you're talking about, that's probably because I have no idea what I'm talking about because I can't pronounce them, all right? But you have other groups from the Southwest, our Pueblo or Anasazi, okay? We have some very distinct groups in the Northeast, which is kind of the groups that I'm most familiar with because that's where I grew up. So the Iroquois, the Algonquin, the ones that all of us are from movies and everything know are Great Plains Indians like the Comanche and the Sioux. And then we have the Pacific Coast ones, examples like the Chinooks, up along the Oregon, Washington coast areas. So we have groups in just about every region of what is modern America with some distinctive characteristics. Now you filled out that chart, and there are probably, depending on what books you looked at or where you looked at on the internet or wherever you got your information for the chart, You can find some details. You should be able to see some similarities, but there's some distinct differences in many of these groups as well. I can't expect you, and I wouldn't ever think that you want to, at least for this course, know like a list of 5 or 6 things that is distinctive about each. But maybe it suffices to know 1 or 2 things that really sets each region out, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So let's kind of go through. Our Mississippi Valley group. One of the most fascinating things, if you read through there, you found is these are our mound building groups, and this is, to me, this is incredible. This is, you know, people, you look at the ancient tombs of Egypt, all these man-made wonders of the world. The mound builders, this is really super cool, and this cultural thing that they perpetuate, that they do, it's something that is unique to their particular region, really, for the most part. And some of the origins of it, there's a lot of probably sacred relationships there and burial type relationships maybe that are involved in some of this. But these Mississippi Valley Native Americans are the mound builders. And so that's kind of one way that I really remember and them, and kind of set them apart a little bit. There's other characteristics, I'm sure, that are on your chart. Our Southwest Native Americans, very unique in a lot of different ways, but the thing that really stands out to me is their housing, their architectural structures that in many cases, they've carved out to the side of mountains or cliffs. I mean, this is, again, an engineering kind of marvel, and it's adapting to the environment that's around them. So those Southwest Indians, Native Americans, that's a really fascinating kind of thing. Our northeastern groups are very, very different, again, in their housing structure, the long houses, and their use of the environment and the timbers and trees that go around them. They're also very unique in their warfare and the close quarters that they happen to find themselves in, close to other native groups. You've got a lot of warfare and tradition wrapped up in that as well. Our Plains Indians, for us, are probably the easiest ones to remember, because almost everything we know from TV, movies, anything else, are derived from our Plains Indians. The teepees, the buffalo hunting, the way they look, everything. When we think of American Indian, usually it's the image of a Plains Indian. Our Plains Indians are nomadic, so that kind of sets them a little bit apart as well. That hence the teepee, right? It's a very portable method of a very portable kind of housing, right? And so our Plains Indians are distinctive, but that's a lot of what we know about West Pacific Indians are, for a number of reasons, the totem poles, that's where they come from. I think that's one of the coolest things about our Northwestern Native American culture. These are also very much a sea people, because they're right there by the Puget Sound and different bodies of water right there. So they are much more sustained on the sea and on the waters than some of the other native groups that we have. Every group has something, guys, and that's what the chart was meant to show you. And hopefully you were able to find things for each group that kind of sets them apart, whether it's how they govern, okay, whether they use chiefdoms like they do in the Northeast. Everything about that chart, the idea is you see some of the similarities across native groups, and you see some of those differences, because there are some common threads and there are some things that are uniquely different. So in that thought, I want you to consider these questions. First, I want you to think about this. You've gone through that, and you can use your chart for this as you answer, because that's probably going to be the best source for this. But I want you to think about, what impact did the environment have on the culture and customs of individual native groups? Okay, so in what way did environment impact their culture and customs? So go ahead and answer that. Okay, and the second question, and very much related, is what other factors other than environment do you think describe the diversity and the differences among native peoples of pre-Columbian America? So what else other than environment makes them different one from another? What other factors kind of push them to be a little bit unique? Great. Okay. So let's look at and compare what you've come up with. And my answers again might not be the same as yours. There are lots of answers here, and so you could probably come up with a couple different things maybe that I don't have here. But this is what came to mind. The environment yields food sources. Food sources means everything from what becomes important to them religiously to to really how well fed and what they look like. It's obviously their environment obviously impacts their housing. Everything from the Northeast, who are doing the Northeastern Indians who are doing the longhouses, to our Plains Indians who are doing teepees because they're nomadic, to our Pueblo who are doing the adobe kind of mountainside houses. That environment shapes that. Your environment also shapes whether you're going to be nomadic or a nomadic group moving around, environment like think of the Plains Indians following the buffalo around, or a sedentary people, an agricultural people that are going to stay put. That is determined by the environment, the climate, and also what trade goods you have available. And so it's going to affect the environment. It's going to say, well, okay, well, what can we draw from here that other tribes or other people might be interested in? And so that's going to affect your trade relationships by the environment that surrounds you. This question is a little bit harder, though. What factors describe diversity other than environment? Because the environment seems to have a huge impact. Well, there's a couple things that I came up with, and then you can probably come up with a couple more yourself. But definitely, isolation, it really could describe that diversity, all right? If you don't have that much interaction with the other Native groups in North America, and you don't have the travel ability, then you're going to probably remain culturally diverse from those other groups based on your environment. So that geographic isolation is really what keeps these people in many cases very diverse. Also, war and conflict can help ensure diversity as well, because that conflict or these differences basically they're out there, you're sustaining your way of life and you're protecting your way of life, one to another group. Instead of merging, conflict's going to suggest that you're going to try to maintain yours. Now, one could argue that conflict and war could also result in the merging of culture and culture diffusion, and that's probably true as well. Maybe there's something else that you thought of that helps describe why the natives of early America stay diverse or are able to be a diverse people. Could it have something to do with where they migrated from originally, where their ancestors came from, as we go back to that first slide that we looked at? So a lot of different things that we consider. So here's what I want you to do, and this is really why any of this matters. Nobody is going to, you're not going to come into an A-push essay and they're going to be like, hey, tell me all about the Mississippi Valley Indians. That's not the important takeaway here, is that you know lots of facts about each different group. But what does matter is, do you see diversity and do you see similarity among these early American groups? Okay, so that's kind of the interesting part of the discussion. And we'll we'll take that just a step further in a second, but we want to find similarities and differences. So again, if you can use your chart, easy for you to say, if you can use your chart here, this will be a great help to you. How these regional groups are similar or different, I want you to take and compare some. So I want you to tell me either a similarity or a difference between each of these two groups. So let's compare our Mesoamerican empires, our maize empires, versus the Great Plains Indians. Give me a similarity or a difference. By the way, difference is always easier. So if you really want to impress, look for a similarity. Okay, here's the next one. Our southwestern tribes, like our Pueblo or Anasazi, versus our northeastern woodland tribes, like Iroquois. Oh, sorry. Okay. So we could review lots of different similarities or differences between those groups. But what you might find is food sources. You might be talking about food sources. You might be talking about religious or cultural similarities or differences in government, organization, permanence, like nomadic versus sedentary, those kinds of things. All right. So that comparison is really what you need to be able to do. how are these groups similar and how are they different? So to that topic, I want you to consider this. It's an interesting question, and it's really the question that's worth asking as far as it goes with our pre-Columbian Native Americans. We're going to look at two passages here from historians. So these are secondary sources. These are historians that have slightly different and slightly similar opinions about their the pre-Columbian Native Americans. So first, we're going to look at Berkhofer. And Berkhofer, well, I'm just going to let the passage speak for itself. You can read it on your own. I'll read it to you as well. But Berkhofer states, the first residents of the Americas were by modern estimates divided into at least 2,000 cultures and more societies, practiced a multiplicity of customs and lifestyles, held an enormous variety of values and beliefs, spoke numerous languages mutually unintelligible to the many speakers, and did not conceive of themselves as a single people, if they knew about each other at all. Okay, so that's Berkhofer's interpretation of pre-Columbian Native Americans. Now, on the other hand, we have Neil Salisbury, and here's his perspective of this. He says, given the archaeological record, North American prehistory can hardly be characterized as a multiplicity of discrete microhistories. Fundamental to the social and economic patterns were exchanges that linked peoples across geographic, cultural, and linguistic boundaries. The effects of these links are apparent in the spread of raw materials and finished goods, of beliefs and ceremonies, and of techniques for food production and for manufacturing. Exchange constitutes an important key to conceptualizing American history before Columbus. I'm going to leave this slide up, hopefully, while this question is asked, but I want you to consider the opinions of both of these gentlemen. Tell me, what is the difference? What is the difference in their interpretation of pre-Columbian Native Americans? Go ahead and answer that, and then I'm also going to ask the follow-up question after that. So here's the thing, guys. These are two well-respected historians, and they don't exactly agree on maybe the perspective of this. I think there's a lot about Native Americans that you would find that they probably agree on, but they're just viewing this a little bit differently. Fundamentally, they're deciding whether we view Native Americans as being more united or more divided as unique cultures. And there's an argument for both. So if we trace it back and go all the way back to where we started this, to what extent were the many Native American groups in pre-Columbian America diverse in terms of culture and customs? How do we stand now? We've talked a little bit about it. You've restudied some of your chart. We've discussed some of the things here. Is there anything that you want to change in that? I'm not going to give you an opportunity to rewrite your response right now, but I want you to think for a moment. Is there anything that we've talked about or discussed right now that you would change from what you wrote at the beginning? I know that it seems like a lot of what we've talked about has shown diversity, but that doesn't mean, as you saw with Berkhofer, that with Salisbury, that some still view it as more uniting than dividing. So do you need to rethink that? And the reason I ask that is because if you do, it will affect this. We're going to take that response here in a moment, and we're going to craft something out of it. So that first response that you had, and this is one of the reasons I told you should probably write it down, is we're going to draw something out of it. We're going to pull a thesis from that, your thesis, your original thesis from your response. Okay, so you wrote a paragraph, which isn't necessarily a thesis, it was just your answer. Okay, but now we can take that paragraph response, that answer to that question, and we can craft a good thesis. So a good thesis let's talk about thesis just for a second so that when you start trying to draw this out, you'll know what you're looking for. Most of you already have a lot of experience with this, but I just want to go back over a couple things to refresh you and maybe say things maybe in a different way than you learned last year that might resonate with you a little bit better. But most of this you should already know. A good thesis will do the following. It will answer the question of the prompt. In this case, it asks, to what extent Were they diverse? So it will answer that. It will answer that question. It will show to what extent they were diverse. Secondly, it's going to establish a clear position on the issue. When you write a thesis, you should be saying something, okay? And what I mean by that is you should not seem like you are simply restating the prompt. You should be taking some kind of position that is going to be defensible, that could be arguable. If somebody cannot argue or debate with you on your thesis, then it probably isn't going out on a limb enough. And then thirdly, a good thesis will provide 2 to 3 brief but succinct but clear reasons for your position. This is what we call a line of reasoning. And really good writers would put an end parenthesis at the end of it. Okay, but this is also known as your line of reasoning. So this is what I believe, and here is the answer because of this, this, and this. All right, so it provides a very succinct kind of overview as to why that is your argument. Okay, so a good thesis answers the question, establishes a clear position, and provides some line of reasoning for that. Okay, a couple other things to keep in mind when people, it sounds easy and it sounds basic, but once you get into it, you know, sometimes it's murky. So another couple things to think about is a thesis does not necessarily have to be one sentence. Some people say that it does. It absolutely does not. And on the APUSH test, if your thesis is in 2 sentences, that is fine. You can still get credit for it. It doesn't matter if such and such a teacher says, well, I don't really like it that way, because it absolutely can in APUSH. Okay. Sometimes I would rather see, and I see this happen all the time, I see huge, cumbersome theses that like go on for half a paragraph, and you're so confused about what you're talking about, and I'm so confused with what you're talking about because you've got so many commas and so many things. It just becomes gigantic, and that's where the clarity goes out the window. So the better way and the clearer way often is, and don't shy away from this, it may sound simplistic to you, but it works really well. I think that this and this and this. No, never mind. That was terrible, by the way. That was a bad way to put it. Let's rephrase that and say, this and this and this and this is true, period. Here are the reasons why this, and this. Okay, it's really hard to do this in hypothetical without using the word I, but we never would use I, right? We know that that's not supposed to be done. So what I mean by this is, you know when that thesis has gotten too long. You know when it's ugly. You know when if you hand it to one of your classmates that they're going to look at that and they're probably going to pass out because they're like, I'm so done reading this. So why not break it? You would if you were in conversation. You would if you were somebody else. Put that period, answer the question, period, line of reasoning, period. Okay? Break it up if it needs to. Okay? Sorry if that was confusing. I started trying to work in a hypothetical world that was really difficult, but I'll show you something a little bit later that might help with it. Finally, secondly, use the language from the prompt. Do not repeat the prompt because that's not a thesis. That's just asking the same question over again. But use the language of the prompt. So if it says, to what extent do Native American customs and culture be diverse? You want to say, Native American cultures were diverse, blah, blah, blah. Like, use a lot of that same kind of language in the response, because that makes sense, right? You're answering the question. You got to speak in terms of the question. Just don't make sure and be very, very careful. You don't parrot back the prompt and never take a position and never answer the question, okay? Thirdly, a good thesis is almost like a mini outline or a roadmap for the full essay on your topic. So that's where your line of reasoning comes in. After you take your position, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to prove it. I'm going to prove it because this is true, and this is true. And each one of those points is later, you're gonna expound on that, and you're gonna take each one of those points and say, okay, here's my evidence. This is why my thesis is correct. And each one of those will probably become like a body paragraph. So your thesis should not only say, here's my position, but it should also suggest, here's how I'm going to show it to you later in this essay. And it should follow that same organization that you would use. Now, we're not writing a full essay right now. We're not writing a full paragraph. We're just writing a thesis. But a good check you can do on your thesis is, all right, does this set me up to write or expound on this more later in an essay if I were to write the full essay, okay? So here's what I want you to do. And by the way, this will be a work in progress, because let me tell you why. Online, it's just a little bit tougher virtually to help you improve in your writing and to instruct in writing. But we'll work it out. We'll work through this. But what I want you to do is I want you to take that paragraph response that you wrote or rethought just a few minutes ago or rewrote, and I want you to use those ideas to craft your own original thesis in response to the prompt. So you're going to take that paragraph, which is essentially your argument, and you're going to craft that into a thesis that you would use. Maybe you're not going to use everything from that paragraph in your thesis, but probably will use those, at least those original ideas, okay? So take those ideas, you're going to craft that into a thesis following those guidelines. Where I want you to put that thesis is in I've got an assignment in the Google Classroom right after this. It's called Native American Thesis, and I want you, once you've got that all figured out, maybe you're writing it down, maybe you're typing it somewhere, copy and paste it, whatever, but you're eventually going to type that or copy and paste that into this place called Native American, the assignment called Native American Thesis, and you're going to submit that. Really super important. This lesson is about to go on a little bit further, and I'm going to talk about a good thesis and a bad thesis. I really need you to put in the thesis that you create right now. It does me no good to go on and to move on and to talk about, okay, here's a good example of a thesis. And you're like, oh, you're right, that is a good thesis. Now that's my thesis, and that's what I'm going to submit. That's not going to help anybody. I need to see what kind of thesis you're writing now. If it's nothing like the theses that we're about to look at, that's fine. But I need to know how you're writing, not how somebody else is writing, okay? So I need your original thesis in that assignment. I'm not grading it on, oh, is this a good thesis or not? I'm going to give you feedback, but I need it to be yours because I need to know where you're at, all right? So make sure that that's the thesis that you write right now is the one that you're going to submit in that Google Classroom assignment, okay? So take a few minutes. You're writing a thesis, so if we were doing an essay, this would be the crux of your paper. So take your time with it a little bit and construct something that you can feel solid about, all right? And then once you do that, go ahead, plop that in the Google Classroom, then come back here and let's finish the video together. Okay. To finish off this lesson, I want to show you, and I know you kind of did the part, but rather than do this at the start of next lesson, I want to wrap it up here. I want you to compare your thesis and look at some things here. So I'm going to go out of this, and here we go. All right. So hopefully you can see this pretty well. It's a little small, so let's zoom it in. But let me show you a couple examples of clear and complete theses. Theses, yeah, I said that. Okay, so funny and kind of weird word. So I like this one. This is an actual example from a prior student. It says, the many Native American groups in pre-Columbian America had much diversity surrounding their respective cultures. Factors such as climate, available resources, or food sources, I'm sorry, and proximity to water changed how and why they adapted differently. Wow, okay, right? Like that's a home run of a thesis. Let's put it to the test. Does it answer the question? The question is, to what extent were Native American groups diverse? And it says many American groups had much diversity. So they answer the question. How diverse were they? Okay, he or she is saying they are very diverse. There's much diversity surrounding their cultures. So they've answered the question. And the answer has provided some kind of position. They've taken a position. They said, okay, yeah, it's very diverse, all right? So now the last check is, have they provided any kind of reasoning or any kind of evidence that they could talk about a little bit more in an essay? They say, okay, here are the factors. Climate, available food sources, and proximity to water changed how and why they adapted differently. Bam, Okay, we know that the next couple paragraphs they're going to talk about climate and say, hey, this is how climate made them different. This is how food sources made them different. That's a great line of reasoning. Okay, you'll also notice that this is a two-sentence thesis. Think how long or cumbersome or awkward this might have been if they had tried to put it into one. The many Native American groups of Pre-Columbian had much diversity surrounding their respective cultures because there were things such as climate availability. It could be done, but put it into two for them. It just worked nice, and it sounds nice, and it's very clear. That would work as a clear thesis, right? Here's another one. The great diversity of culture amongst the many Native American groups of pre-Columbian America can be accredited to the complicated geography of the continents, the lack of fast transportation, and the lack of a common language with which to communicate. Another very good one. They've gone in one sentence, and it works here. So did they answer the question? Yes, they have made the claim that there's great diversity of culture among the many Native American groups. So yes, they've answered the question, and they've shown to what extent they're diverse, and at the same time, they've made their own claim. Yes, they're saying, okay, they're very diverse. That's their claim, right? Have they provided any kind of reasoning for that? Yes, they have. They can attribute this or accredit this to the complicated geography of the continents, no fast transportation, and no common language. So that kind of contributed in the eyes of this person, that contributed to this diversity. Fantastic. Now, before we go any further, and before I show you the ones that need reworked, could you have argued that cultures of Native Americans, could your thesis have said the cultures of Native American groups were not that diverse? Absolutely you could, okay? That's kind of going back to Salisbury and what he was arguing. Certainly you could. And you could say they had networks of trade that united them. You had similarities in religious and political structures. You could argue the other side of it. So just because these both said that they were greatly diverse doesn't mean that that's how you did. But no matter what you did, you would have to show or answer the question, which was to what extent. Anytime you see the phrase in a prompt, to what extent, you want to consider that they're asking how much. How different or how diverse were they? Were they very diverse? Were they not very diverse? That's what the phrase to what extent means. So if you didn't answer that part of it in your thesis, you didn't answer the question. How much? If you didn't say how diverse were they, to what extent are they diverse, you're not showing what they are asking you to show. Okay, so really familiarize with that phrase because it shows up in all kinds of essays. To what extent basically means how much, how diverse were they? Okay, now let me show you some examples of some theses that need reworked. It doesn't mean that they're bad, it just means that they need reworked, right? Okay, there's might be foundational principles here. It says, in pre-Columbian America, the many Native American groups' diversity in culture is due to the people and things brought to the groups. Okay. There's a couple things on here. One, I would say that it doesn't answer the question because it doesn't say how much. The prompt already told you that they were somewhat diverse. It says to what extent were they diverse. They're already admitting that there's diversity happening there. But you just said the Native American groups' diversity in culture, that they were diverse, okay? So make sure that you show to what extent. They haven't really answered the question. They haven't said Native Americans were very diverse or they weren't diverse, so you haven't really taken a position. You're just basically saying Native Americans were diverse. That's what it said in the prompt, okay? So you haven't taken that position. And it's due to the people and things brought into the group. By the way, people and things probably do not qualify as a solid line of reasoning. They're very, very vague terms. You could use that in any thesis, right? The market revolution is due to the people and things that were involved, right? The Industrial Revolution happened because of the many people and things that were part of that. The Civil Rights Movement was a result of the people and things that were involved. You know, so like you could use that as kind of a carte blanche on anything. So it does need to be more specific than that in the line of reasoning. Finally, the last one says, diversity of culture among the Native American groups was triggered by many different aspects, okay? I'm gonna leave that one to you. I'm gonna stop it here, and I want you to tell me why you think maybe what about this thesis might need to be reworked. Go ahead and put that now. Okay, what'd you come up with? So, does it answer the question? Diversity of culture among the Native American groups was triggered by? Probably not. Again, it admits that there was diversity, but it doesn't really say to what extent, how much. So you really haven't made an argument here. So there's one thing. And then I would definitely say that was triggered by many different aspects is not specific enough of a line of reasoning. You haven't said why. You haven't explained where you're going to go from here. Now, here's something that you could do to fix it. Listen, let's say the great diversity of culture among the Native American groups. Okay, so there you fixed it. Fixed the first part. You've said how diverse or how much. And then it was triggered by many different aspects, period. Some of these aspects were, right? So now you're going to go on, you're going to offer that line of reasoning in another sentence. It's broken down to be clear. Now, the fact that they haven't said what those aspects are just leaves it too vague, but you could go on to list those in a new sentence, and probably in the same sentence if you use your commas right, and you could still explain what those aspects are, and that would fill in the rest of it. So that would kind of change it as well. I'm going to take those. I'm going to look at where we're at on our theses. It will show us a couple things. Number one, it's going to show me how well you understand the diversity of culture among Native Americans, but it's also going to show me where you are with your thesis. A lot today. We kind of killed two birds with one stone a little bit today. We talked a lot about our Native American groups and analyzed the diversity of cultures and similarities between them, and we've also approached talking about developing a thesis. So hopefully that was helpful to you, or will continue to be helpful to you as we revisit that in future lessons, and you were able to get something out of that. We are moving from here, so now that we've talked about Native American groups or pre-Columbian Native American groups, we're ready to introduce our Europeans. So our next lesson is going to talk about what's going on in Europe and what's going to bring them across and what some of that first contact is going to look like. So we'll look at what you put here on these things, see where we're at with our thesis, and hopefully you've got that Native American chart finished. If you still don't have it done, you're now officially behind on that. So make sure you catch up with it, and we'll be moving right along. Have a great day. We'll talk to you later.